In 1997, Ted Turner bought a ranch in New Mexico that cattle had been trampling for decades. But instead of grazing cows on it again, he began raising rodents, the most hated pest of the American West, an animal the federal government had been poisoning and gassing for a century. Local ranchers called him crazy. The state even tried to stop him. But something began to change, and 25 years later, a mammal that America had all but written off as gone forever appeared on his land again. The night of September 26, 1981, a ranch near the town of Meeteetse, Wyoming. The dog's name was Shep. That morning he went outside and came back with something in his mouth. A long body, golden fur, black feet, and a black stripe across the face, like a mask. The owners didn't know what it was. They took the body to a taxidermist. He looked at it and named an animal that was considered extinct, that hadn't been seen in the wild for years, one the United States government had already written into the lists of what no longer exists. The animal was called Mustela nigripes, the black-footed ferret, the only ferret native to North America, and in the 20th century it had been buried twice. After Shep's discovery, biologists combed the hills around Meeteetse and found more living individuals, about 130 animals scattered among prairie dog burrows. Hope returned for a few years. And then plague came. Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that caused the Black Death in medieval Europe, only in its wild, sylvatic form. It cut through the prairie dogs and with them the ferrets, which ate nothing else. By 1985, of that 100-odd ferrets, 18 remained on the entire planet. Biologists made a decision that to many felt like surrender. Capture every last one. Remove them from the wild completely to save at least some in captivity. Of those 18, only 7 produced offspring. Today, every black-footed ferret on Earth is a descendant of those 7. But here lies the trap that nearly made the species disappear forever. The ferret is an obligate predator. This means it eats only prairie dogs. And the prairie dog had been destroyed by America for an entire century. It was considered a pest. Farmers and ranchers said it ate up pasture land and dug burrows that broke the legs of cattle. From 1915 onward, the federal government launched poisoning campaigns that lasted for decades. Prairie dogs were poisoned, gassed, and shot. The result is a number that is hard to take in. The prairie dog population fell by 98%. Today, they occupy roughly 2% of the territory where they once lived. Colonies that had blanketed the plains from Canada to Mexico and numbered in the billions shrank to scattered fragments. And here is the paradox at which this entire story begins. To save one of the world's rarest predators, an animal everyone wants to bring back, you first have to save the rodent everyone wants to exterminate. You have to protect the pest to get back the hero. No one in their right mind would build their life's work on this. No one except a person who had been told they were out of their mind. Ted Turner was not a biologist. He founded CNN. He created round-the-clock news at a time when everyone said it was impossible. And somewhere in the middle of his life, he began buying land to build nothing on it. By the end, Turner owned approximately 2 million acres across the American West, in New Mexico, Colorado, Montana, Nebraska, and other states. One of the largest private landowners in the country. But instead of turning these lands into resorts, he turned them into an ark. In 1997, Turner, together with his family and biologist Mike Phillips, founded the Turner Endangered Species Fund. The goal was simple and audacious. Take species on the edge of extinction and return them to private land, where there are none of the bureaucratic brakes that strangle work on federal territories. The Mexican wolf, the Aplomado falcon, the Bolson tortoise, the prairie dog, and the black-footed ferret. The fund's director, Mike Phillips, described the ferret without sentimentality. If you purposely designed an endangered species, you might design the black-footed ferret, and added, they weren't dealt a good hand. Turner's biggest bet was Vermejo Park Ranch, 560,000 acres on the border of New Mexico and Colorado. ranging from short grass prairie to alpine tundra at elevations above 4,000 meters. He bought it exhausted, trampled by decades of overgrazing. And then he did something no rational ranch owner in the history of the American West had ever done. For centuries, Turner's neighbors had been poisoning prairie dogs. Turner began raising them. Instead of reducing the colonies, he let them grow. At Vermejo, they were brought to approximately 12,000 acres of continuous settlements. To the ranchers around him, this looked like madness. A man was spending a fortune made in television to breed the very creature their grandfathers had been poisoning for decades. But Turner knew an arithmetic that others couldn't see. No prairie dogs, no ferrets. If you want to bring back the predator, first grow the world it needs. And when the prairie dog colonies at Vermejo had grown to the necessary scale, Turner's fund took the next step, the one the whole effort had been building toward. They approached the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with a proposal: "We have the land, we have the prairie dogs, let's bring back the ferret." This was not simply a decision, it was years of preparation. Because before releasing the first ferret into the prairie, a problem had to be solved that no one had fully solved before. How do you teach an animal born in a cage to survive in the wild? There was a bitter coincidence in this story that few knew about. One of the last historical specimens of black-footed ferret collected in New Mexico had been trapped here, on the very land that now belonged to Turner, near Castle Rock on Vermejo. A ferret born in captivity cannot simply be driven out to the prairie and released. Survival rates 1 month after release are only 11%. They don't know how to hunt. So biologists developed a conditioning system. Ferrets were placed in large open outdoor enclosures where there were real burrows and live prairie dogs. There, an animal that had never seen prey learned to kill on its own. After this preparation, survival rates tripled. Every year, between 150 and 220 ferrets go through this system across the country and are then released into the wild. In September 2007, the first trial release took place at Vermejo Ranch. 6 family groups of ferrets, each mother with her young, were released onto a prairie dog colony called Phone Line. Not just released and left. Biologists walked the prairie at night with flashlights, searching for the characteristic emerald green reflection of eyes in the dark. This was how they tracked who had survived, who had moved on, who had vanished. Some of those first release ferrets dispersed to neighboring prairie dog colonies and stayed. This provided the basis for the next step. In 2008, Vermejo Park Ranch became the 18th official ferret reintroduction site in the United States. Not an experimental pen, not a trial, fully, with complete federal authorization for species recovery. The first years gave grounds for cautious optimism. The ferrets were not merely surviving, they were reproducing in the wild. Biologists recorded new kits born not in captivity but right in the burrows of Vermejo. Every autumn, the team went out on night surveys with flashlights and microchip readers implanted in each animal back at the breeding center. They walked in lines through the prairie, methodically scanning every burrow. If 2 emerald green pinpoints flared from the darkness, a ferret, alive. If silence, unknown. This was how they counted who had made it through the winter, who was new, who had disappeared. This was not the romance of wildlife, this was work with spreadsheets and coordinates in the dark of the prairie. For several years running, the numbers grew. Vermejo was becoming one of the few places where ferrets were not merely maintained through annual releases, but beginning to reproduce on their own. Exactly what the program had sought from the beginning. And at the foundation of this success were the prairie dogs. The same animal America had been poisoning for a century. At Vermejo, their colonies had grown large enough to feed and shelter an entire ferret population. One person decided not to poison them, and it changed everything. Running parallel to this was another part of the story, one that 20 years earlier would have belonged to science fiction. The entire living population of ferrets descends from 7 ancestors. 7 animals. That is a genetic needle's eye. A species this constrained is defenseless. One new disease could destroy it a 3rd time and permanently because all individuals are too closely related, but there had been an 8th. In 1988, a female black-footed ferret named Willa died. She never produced offspring. Her genes never entered the modern population. Someone with foresight took a tissue sample and froze it in the San Diego Zoo's frozen zoo. Her cells lay there for over 3 decades. In 2020, a living animal was created from those cells, Elizabeth Ann, the first clone of an endangered species in United States history. Then, from the same material, 2 more clones of Willa were produced, Noreen and Antonia. In June 2024, Antonia gave birth to a litter. 2 kits survived, a female named Cybert and a male named Red Cloud. For the first time in history, a clone of an endangered species had produced offspring for population recovery. Willa's genes, locked in a freezer since the days when the Soviet Union still existed, came alive again in living ferrets. Willa became the 8th founder of the species, 36 years after her death. Meanwhile, in New Mexico, a very different battle was playing out, one with politics. Turner was doing exactly what federal conservationists had wanted from him. His ranches were a government partner in the recovery of not only ferrets, but also the Mexican wolf. At Ladder Ranch, another of his properties in New Mexico, a permit to hold Mexican wolves in pre-release enclosures had been in effect for 17 consecutive years. In 2014, New Mexico changed its rules. In May 2015, the director of the Department of Game and Fish denied Ladder Ranch's renewal of the wolf permit, the one that had been in effect for 17 years. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service spoke out publicly, declaring that the ranch had been an outstanding partner and that it was disappointed, but the state did not back down. The ranch appealed. On January 14, 2016, the commission met in Santa Fe. Dozens of people in the room silently held up yellow signs. More wolves, less politics. The commission voted 7-0, appeal denied. The man who had spent part of his fortune saving endangered species on his own land had just been expelled by the state from a program in which he had worked for nearly 2 decades, not for failure, for a success that had become inconvenient. Let's count what came of all this. From 18 animals in 1985 to several hundred in the wild today. The most recent estimates give between 300 and 500 individuals, depending on the year, distributed across approximately 20 reintroduction sites in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. This is the story of an animal taken off life support that is still breathing on its own. Turner's work received a level of government recognition that almost no one has received. The director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service called the partnership with Turner and his fund arguably the most significant public-private conservation partnership in the world. But to understand the true cost of those numbers, you have to see what this work looks like from the inside. Every spring, teams of biologists place plague vaccine bait at prairie dog burrows, millions of baits across thousands of acres. Every autumn, night surveys with flashlights, several hours of walking in the dark, a beam of light into a burrow, waiting for the green reflection of eyes. Then the microchip reader, and you know whether this is a ferret released the previous year or one already born here. Over 30 years, more than 4,500 ferrets have passed through the program, each with a chip and a history. And behind all of this, people. Scientists, volunteers, tribal lands of indigenous nations, small ranchers who gave up the right to poison prairie dogs. This network keeps the species alive just as surely as the genetics in Turner's land do. On Vermejo itself, the land where this whole New Mexico story began, the ferret program had to be wound down. The reason turned out to be not what anyone had expected. Black-footed ferrets did not survive in dry years. Less rain meant fewer prairie dogs, and fewer prairie dogs meant starvation. In 2013, the Turner Fund made a clear-eyed decision: cease releases on Vermejo's black-tailed prairie dog colonies because droughts were becoming more frequent and more severe. Climate had crossed out the plans. The team did not give up, it fell back to higher ground. The new focus is on Gunnison's prairie dogs in the high-elevation meadows around Castle Rock. The goal, grow a colony to 3,000 to 5,000 acres, and once the prairie dogs occupy more than 2,000, begin fighting the plague, vaccinating them and treating the burrows against the fleas that carry the bacterium. Because plague has gone nowhere. It is the primary threat to ferret recovery across the entire range, and there is no simple defense against it. In 2018, a plague outbreak collapsed an entire ferret population at another Turner ranch in South Dakota. So the question this story leaves open is an uncomfortable one. What have we actually built? A species recovery or an endless life support system? The ferrets are alive because people breed them in captivity every year, release them, vaccinate the prairie dogs, and monitor every burrow. Remove the human hand for a few years, and nobody knows whether anything would remain. And the prairie dog, without which the ferret does not exist, is still legally poisoned and shot as a pest in most states. The same animal Turner raised on his land dies on neighboring ranches across the fence. The federal program coordinator spoke about this without illusions. You cannot wind the clock back, let go of your hand, and expect it to keep ticking on its own. This, he said, will require constant intervention. Always. How many generations of people are prepared to keep their hand on that clock? 20 years? 100? Forever? Nobody knows. And that is the whole point. On May 6, 2026, Ted Turner died. He was 87, but the program did not stop. 2 million acres of his land, according to Turner Enterprises, will remain protected from development and subdivision. At Rarest Ranch in New Mexico, the second largest permanent conservation easement in the United States is in effect, a legal guarantee that this land will remain prairie regardless of who owns it. At Vermejo and Bad River Ranch in South Dakota, Turner's team continues working with federal and state scientists on black-footed ferret population recovery. The Turner Endangered Species Fund is still operating and still proving that private individuals can play a central role in saving species from the edge of extinction. But the threats have not gone anywhere. Today there are approximately 500 ferrets in the wild, and the program's goal is 3,000. Only then can the species be downlisted from endangered to vulnerable. Federal funding freezes and government shutdowns directly threaten the annual releases. The window for them is narrow and cannot be moved. From 500 to 3,000 is a whole generation of work.